The public have a lot of questions about television, and me, as they should. For as much as we live in an age of disposable slop where the scripts might as well start with, sure, here's a quirky true crime premise, people yearn for more. Frankly, they always have. You being here listening to this is proof of that. Don't click off, I will get to The Sopranos. We are right to demand more from the work and art that we consume, even if we don't want to spend all day thinking about it and would rather watch someone else do it. Like me! After the smash hit success of the Sopranos videos and the Dexter videos, I'm delighted to say that we have now reached 10,000 subscribers. There is no other way to say this, but thank you. Thank you so much. This is a moment I'd never really imagined until now. I feel ecstatic, but I also feel under so much pressure to deliver. We've all been there with our first girlfriends, boyfriends, but I didn't think it would happen on YouTube.com. And to celebrate this milestone, I have asked you, dear viewer, to leave some lovely, lovely questions. And you have!
Questions, queries, quiz!
I had simply too many to answer, but I'm going through some of the best questions I received, and the ones that I know people will want to hear an answer for. So many, of course, about The Sopranos, but also plenty of others about these videos themselves, and some about me personally. So let me endeavour to answer as many as I can. I wanted to give these questions the thought that they deserved, and give you, the viewer, something of the quality you'd come to expect from this channel. What I will say is that this video will be light on visuals, because I have a deadline to reach. This video, in theory, will cover all 6 or 7 seasons of The Sopranos, but there won't be much in the way of narrative discussion. So, let's get started with the question in the title. Who do you see as the best director of The Sopranos? From Frank. Well, let me be frank, by saying that the best Sopranos director is not David Chase. He may be, in fact, one of the poorer episode directors. Chase was a much better writer than he is a director, and you can tell this from the comparatively confused and conflicted nature of the pilot. Is it Scorsese? Is it Fellini? Is it Soap? The tone of the pilot is, retroactively, better, but in isolation it is a little bit woozy. It needs a steady hand, it needs a real director to get it moving. I think Chase would likely agree with me though, for once. He doesn't set the tone so much as offer many different avenues that the show could go down. It's up to quality established directors to get things going. Something interesting to me is the show's initial lack of getting what you could describe as established talent to come in and direct it. A lot of American sitcoms will, in their infancy, try and get James Burrows to direct an episode or 5. Burrows is and was considered one of the most prolific TV comedy directors who has ever lived, and his work is of a noticeably high standard. He can rescue things that other people just can't. He is a trusted pair of hands. So it's very surprising to me that quite a lot of the directors of the first season of The Sopranos are kind of new to directing. At the time, they were untested, unproven. The Sopranos gave them a perfect opportunity to, well, in some cases, royally fuck it up. The Sopranos' first season, keeping to Chase's description, are like 13 little films, each with their own directors. Mostly directors who worked on just a single episode, and it shows. In essence, Chase used this first series to audition writers and directors, and if they kept to executing what he had in mind for the show, or something of the quality that he wanted, they stayed, and if they didn't, the door is that way. Going back to what I said in the first part of The Sopranos Season 3, whatever you call it, there's a deep struggle in the early series around finding a voice, and this is definitely part of it. If there was a series director for the whole thing, I don't know if it would have necessarily had this issue. But it is what it is, it's still brilliant. It would take a few years for Chase to whittle down the right people that have the chops to bring The Sopranos together the way that he would want. Remember that Chase is still the band leader, even if conventionally that role should fall to the director. Even if The Sopranos borrowed heavily from cinema, this is television. Being television, not cinema. The next question that arises when you answer the question of who is the best director should be whether they are the best at translating Chase's vision, or the best at making captivating films. Neither are mutually exclusive. You can be fantastic at both. I also think it's really important for me to say that directors are not all about the look and feel. I think sometimes we think of all directors as being solely skilled at compositing. This simply isn't true. A large part of directing is the literal direction, getting the best performances out of actors, and building a world for the story to be told in. We should credit the right things to the right people. This is what cinematographers, DPs are for. The camera work on the corporate shoots I've directed aren't groundbreaking pieces of cinematography, but the best films I've directed are the ones where the actors are getting the most out of the material. I've been able to help them get there. I'm going to be honest, I'm very proud of the times where I've clawed good performances out of people you wouldn't have seen it from. I've worked with trained actors who think they're too good for everything and still somehow suck. And amdram part-timers and pensioners who knock it out of the park. Sometimes they're filming corporate videos together. How do you manage the two? Well, I've managed to do it. The Sopranos doesn't have much in the way of stunt casting. There's a lot of Broadway talent, but there's also a lot of character actors, or background actors best known for being frightened mobster number 2. Even worse, there are child actors, and they are always terrible. I know, I was a failed one, and I know I was a brat back then. Then I went my own way and made it, etc., etc. I've also been on the other end as an actor, with directors who aren't good with shooting people. I've been told many times to do what you think works, which obviously doesn't really work when there's no character to go off. I would say the biggest part of being a good director is communicating ideas clearly, getting a read of what the actors you have on hand can do and coaxing the best out of them. Is having that ability to get something across to people who only ever see their part of the process, quite literally for actors on call sheets. Once they're wrapped, they're out. It's not like they're hanging around. Is working with the rest of the team to get the best out of everyone in that moment. Is hard on the small scale that I'm used to, and I imagine it's even harder with egoist Hollywood actors high off the supply of being in television's big hit drama. I think it speaks a lot to the competency of a director by how much they can get out of something new to a long-running work, be it a person, a theme, a location. Stellar actors can be directed poorly, new ideas can be explored terribly, new locations can just not work. Art directors can do something beautiful, writers can write perfect dialogue, actors can try, but it can all just fail if it's not directed properly. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the most experienced and prolific directors of the show. I think this should also start to challenge some of the auteur framing that The Sopranos has, and that I've directly contributed to. We will talk about this at another time, but I think it's really interesting how much of an individual impact these directors had once you start to unpick it and analyse it. I think it's only fair to really judge the more prolific directors, because otherwise we could be here forever. Per IMDb, there are 4 directors who have directed more than 5 episodes. This criterion deliberately leaves out David Chase, along with Mike Figgis, RIP Shooting People, and Steve Buscemi. They already get enough credit, I think. Let's talk about some of the more prolific and I would argue slightly more anonymous directors of the show. Those 4 are Tim Van Patten, John Patterson, Alan Coulter, and Alan Taylor. I'll run through these 4 and what makes some of their styles unique, and then crown my favourite. We'll assess them on a completely unique criteria that no one else has come up with. The signature challenge, where they show off their best abilities, the technical challenge that shows off their real nous and skill, and of course their showstopper episode, the one that really stands out as being just perfect. Which one of them will be crowned as star filmmaker? Find out now. Tim Van Patten is the most prolific, starting in the first season with The Legend of Tennessee Moltisanti, an early example of deviating away from the Tony focus that the show initially has. By nature of being the most prolific, he simultaneously has directed some of the best and worst episodes of the show. His best work focuses on the adventures of people other than Tony, and places other than the immediate Bing, Soprano household and Satriali's, which I think is why he may have been kept around past the first season when many weren't. Something as visually challenging as going back to Italy feels familiar as handled by Van Patten. It doesn't feel completely alien. It could be directed terribly. To compare this to something not as good, when Dexter as a series changes locations to somewhere different that isn't Miami, you wouldn't notice. Miami isn't really given enough of a character. Think of how visually stark the difference between The Sopranos New Jersey and The Sopranos Italy is. It's new as well, it's not just meant to be The Godfather Part 2. It is a distinctive living place, with its own character and voice. I could list all 20 of Van Patten's episodes, but I'm just going to focus on some of the best moments of his career here. The best ones. There's the episode where Tony goes to Italy, Commendatore. There's the episode where Tony is plucked from his usual scenario and put into the waste management company that he pretends to run. Again, familiar characters, different setting. This seems to be something he's really, really good at. The one where Livia dies, the one where Carm goes to the therapist, the episode that ties up Jackie Jr. and Gloria Trillo, and yes, they are connected, the one where Chrissy finds out about what Aid's been up to, the one where Vito is outed, the one where Vito is outed again, and of course the episode where Phil turns into a house. Van Patten as a director seems to get the most out of Michael Imperioli, who played Chrissy. The episodes he directs tend to feature a lot of Chrissy, but also a lot of different layers of Chrissy. Chrissy generally tends to be in one of his usual crises, a real test of faith moment, and test of faith moments that require a lot of just him being him, sometimes in a room with nobody else. Ones that really analyse Chrissy's small-mindedness but big vision. This is something that some directors ignore, but Van Patten really seems to have the finger on the pulse for. The same goes for Vito as well, who again is thrust into very strange locations and men. He manages to capture both the sensitivity and sociopathy in Vito that we don't really see anyone else bother to do. In these episodes, we get really interesting looks at the characters on their own, left to their own devices and with their own thoughts, torturing them constantly. Being able to do this is so much harder than I've made it sound. This takes a lot of skill, and a good working relationship, but also an understanding of what Impellielli does best. For that, I would say The Legend, etc., is Van Patten's signature episode. It encompasses a lot of what he does really, really well. And that is getting Chrissy pissy. Well, it's obviously more than that too. Visually, my least favourite episode of the show is a Van Patten affair. That would be the shaky cam chasing it. But the direction of people in chasing it is exceptionally solid. The C-plot of the episode focuses on Vito Jr.'s goth life, and, well, directing children is nigh on impossible at the best of times, and Brandon Hallen, who plays Vito Jr., works really well. Vito's wife, another sideline character that's not really given much attention before, has to give an emotional performance that could completely fail in less competent hands. Yeah, moments of great directing happen in episodes that are visually a bit ropey, big diff. But actually, even though I don't personally like it, I do think it has a lot to say. It does try something different, but it doesn't feel immediately out of place. It doesn't feel wrong per se. So I'd say this is Tim's technically challenging episode. This is definitely the one that I think really sticks out. It is also fair to say that the worst moment of any directing does happen in a Van Patten episode. Yes, of course, we're talking about the Tony talking to the CGI Livia, but that's just one scene. The rest of the episode is stellar. One of the best of the third season. Van Patten doesn't really do a lot of the surreal stuff, or at least not very often, though the one really memorable case, which also happens in that episode where Livia dies, is really well executed. But Van Patten's showstopper episode, at least for me, is Commendatore. Again, so many of his great things really come into play here. His ability to pick up new locations and settings, and develop new characters and flesh them out in seconds. The episode's beginning is a carjacking of a white, waspy, middle-class family by two gangsters. There's a real intensity and brutality to how it's directed, and also the performances. Not easy viewing. This is meant to be a brutal eye in how the sausage, aka Tony Soprano's money, is made. It's not meant to be pretty. And it's immediately stacked up with Tony Soprano enjoying photographs of the car that we know was stolen. The mob wives also get a good look in this episode too, and are given new depths that they aren't really given before. Especially Big Pussy's wife, who reveals to the group that she's on the verge of a mental breakdown. The plastic sympathy of the other mob wives, who are more concerned about causing a scene. And of course all of this happening to the backing of Plastic Bocelli. It's chaotic but very well put together. There's lots of fantastic framing in the Commendatore episode. There's so many shots that just make them seem out of their depth or like ants, even if it's not explicitly telling you to feel this way. It's got a lot to say, it's got a lot of different ways of saying it, and ultimately it is his showstopper, it's his big moment. So, that's Van Patten. Now let's talk about Patterson. John Patterson was another mainstay director for the show. He's best known for directing the series finales for each season, and episodes like The Happy Wanderer, or the one where Davy Scatino loses all his money. His strength to me outside of the finales is the more visceral stories that reappraise some of the characters we already know. Melfi's traumatic assault and her road to recovery, AJ's perils at the hands of being sent to a military school run by Jigsaw, Carmela's ongoing descent from Tony, and the breakdown of their relationship. He was also simply the best at capturing Tony and Carmela's fragility as a couple. The most powerful arguments they have are left in his hands. He directed the fourth season finale Whitecaps, which might as well be a two-hander extended argument between the pair. Phenomenal stuff. And for that reason, Whitecaps is his signature episode. It does what he does best. Patterson's strength was not directing action. In my opinion, some of the worst directed bits of action actually happen in Patterson's first season finale. There is more of an emotional depth to Patterson's work though. He's probably the worst at keeping distant, which to some may be a better thing than others. His work tends to be the most emotionally resonant and grounded within the show's run. Even the little touches, I would argue, have weight other directors may not have captured in the same way. He directed the episode where Feech Lamana, an old-school maid-on-the-other-side made man, is put back inside after 5 minutes of trying to get back into the life. Feech's dull pain of life back behind bars on the one hand mirrors the mundane drives we have seen other characters have, indeed in some of his episodes. But there's such a depth to Legia's wistful waiting that Patterson drew out. He does such a good job of simultaneously playing Feech as someone both who loves and loathes for life on the inside. This is a real strength that Patterson had. Sadly, Patterson passed away before the series finished. I would have been fascinated to see how he would have tackled some of the final season, especially some of the veto stuff. On a technical level, I would say his best episode is, by far, Funhouse. While I'd say Patterson's best work is not really the experimental parts of the show, he did direct two of the most important dream sequence moments in the show, ones that really established the language that the show would come to use as it delved more into these. Funhouse as an experience is so well constructed, and I really love the fact that it effortlessly slips from dream to reality in a way that you can't really pick out. Patterson had such a good grasp of flow in these dream states. It's such a small detail, but look at how inhuman the human movement is here, and how unnerving it is, how uncanny it is. And swinging back the other way from the more experimental edge to performances, his showstopper episode has to be Employee of the Month. It's one of the best directed things. Lorraine Bracco is a fantastic actress, but the way he was able to coax so much depth out of his performance, and even Melfi's son, who's usually a bit of a dud, is simply phenomenal in this episode. The way it's directed and structured also invites really difficult questions for the audience, questions that I don't think would have been raised in the same way by another director. I think Patterson had a real skill here. If you haven't seen the video Did the Sopranos Change TV, I talk a lot about Employee of the Month in there, so please do watch that. But to reiterate myself briefly, the deliberate contrast between the assaults of Janice and Melfi, how one is taken seriously for obvious reasons and one isn't taken seriously for less obvious reasons, is interesting to me. It's a deliberate choice, and it's something that Patterson is able to express very well. He also manages to get some fantastic performances out of the female cast members of the show. Really, truly phenomenal stuff. So that's our first two. Let's now talk about Alan Coulter. Coulter was, for the longest time, the only staff director. He was the only one directly employed by Sopranos Productions Incorporated. He is best known for directing College and University, often considered two of the best directed episodes. College especially is considered the high watermark of the early series, if not television as a whole. I know I'm awarding them out of order, but College is so obviously his best technical work, there's no real comparison. After College, he went on to direct some of the most experimental episodes in the show's run. Episodes like Isabella, an early first season episode establishing and illustrating the gap between Tony's perception and the reality that confronts him. The third season premiere, Mr. Ruggiero's Neighbourhood, which serves as a neat introduction into the perspective changes present in that third season. And of course, The Test Dream, the most radical and experimental hour of American television in between both finales of Twin Peaks. Truly phenomenal stuff. The Test Dream will get its own video several times longer than The Dream one day, and so will Kevinfinity. The showstopper is obviously The Test Dream, and I don't know, the signature is probably Mr. Ruggiero's Neighbourhood. I promise I'm not trying to phone in my own rules here, it's just very difficult to judge things very literally like this. Coulter's work doesn't necessarily get the best performances out of people, but it explores the best ideas. His best strength is putting something radical or new in front of you and making it somehow feel familiar. At no point in that third season episode, where the perspective is entirely flipped from the mob to the FBI, do you feel like you're wasting your time or that something's wrong, it just is different. Even an episode such as College, which is far more literal than something like The Test Dream, still manages to give you a different perspective that you're not used to, a story expressed in a way that's very different to what you would come to expect, and giving you as a viewer some tools to reappraise some of the things that you've seen before, both subconsciously and effortlessly. So, finally, that brings us to Alan Taylor, who, while starting with the first season episode, ended up directing large parts of the final season. His specialty seems to be getting to the end of the script, executing David Chase's vision as described. Now, I don't want to be unfair here. The episodes under his belt are well managed and consistently great, but they're just on. He can do decay very well. There's a foreboding hollow darkness that peppers his final episodes. They're all about death, but I just don't think they're as well handled as earlier events. Jackie Jr.'s funeral is directed a much better way by Patterson than Taylor handles Chrissy's. However, he nails the comedy of the show. He directs the funniest bust-up in the entire run. He directed the Chrissy intervention. I think in Van Patten's hands it might have ended up being a bit more soulful, but that wouldn't have been as impactful. Again, different people have different strengths. He directs Paulie Walnuts sublimely, leading to his best stories and outbursts. His reckoning with his new dad could have been executed in a very different way had it not been for Taylor's approach. Again, going back to Chrissy's funeral, I feel like Paulie's indignation about no one caring about his mother's funeral happening the same day would have been a much rougher watch had it been directed by Patterson, for example. His signature episode is probably the episode titled The Fleshy Part of the Thigh. This is the episode where Paulie finds out that he's not really as Italian as he thinks, and Tony comes out of the coma. These story beats have some of Paulie's best lines and best moments. The real shock and destruction of his entire identity in front of him makes for very funny viewing. Tony's stay in the hospital also takes a more balanced and humorous tone, as he begins to forge a new outlook on life based on his experiences within the coma, presumably. Even though it's so tied to the events of the last 3 weeks so closely, far more closely than The Sopranos usually is, it's still really well handled, and I think it encapsulates a lot of the quirks that make Taylor's work uniquely his. I'm going to slightly cheat here because I think the technical and the showstopper challenges, as I think both of them require 2 episodes to answer that question. These 2 happen at the end of the series, and they are The Blue Comet and Kennedy and Heidi. Both of them focus on the deaths of 2 major characters. Both are handled with the appropriate amount of weight, and being frank, you just don't see them coming the first time you see it. This is why I'm trying to be a bit vague here. I know people will have watched this video without seeing it. I don't want to ruin these scenes for you. Despite this, both of them have some of the best lines of dialogue in the show and some of the funniest little bits. The mistaken identity stuff that forms a large part of the plot of The Blue Comet is macabre, but it is also quite funny. Then, suddenly, it all goes to shit. Both of these episodes also end with Taylor taking us to a completely new location that feels just unlike anything else we've seen. The desert at the end of Kennedy and Haiti also gives us one of the few glimpses into Tony's real emotional state. It's fascinating stuff. And again, you have to be really competent at getting great performances out of people to get to this point. While, yes, I do think that his episodes look a bit drab and aren't particularly visually inspired, the way he can coax out people playing it straight while still being funny, phenomenal stuff. And really, really skilled. So there you have them, the 4 horsemen. I don't think it's fair to say that there's a best, which is obviously the question that you asked me about 20 minutes ago, sorry about that. But my personal favourite is Coulter. Now I said I would only focus on those 4, but I do want to briefly touch on some of the other, less prolific directors. David Nutter being brought in to direct the start of the Kevin Finnerty Dream Scenario was a fantastic choice. The Kevin stuff is a new world, taken in a very different direction, so why not bring in someone best known for developing and directing pilot episodes of programs? They didn't really do this before, this sort of stunt directing, if you will, but it works here really, really well. He treats it as if it's a new program, and that is extremely ambitious for a show that's been on for nearly 7 years. Peter Bogdanovich, best known for directing Targets, being Melfi's therapist and the man on the other side of David Chase in the interview I keep referring back to, directed a single episode that's pretty good, and gets a lot of mileage out of Steve Buscemi's character, Tony That Animal Blundetto. Obviously it doesn't need to be said that the award-winning Steve Buscemi is very good, but he's able to plumb a new depth that we haven't seen before. And the worst directed episode is obviously A Hit is a Hit for one with massive genius. To love something is to be open to criticising it, which is why I don't mind slagging this episode off. There are things about it that really work. I find the band that recorded in Denmark funny. I find Chrissy as a character very funny in this episode. But all of the stuff with Hesh and Massive Genius is just shit. By the standards of the show, poorly put together, poorly paced, poorly acted, poorly composited, just messy. I just don't like it. Now to move on to something slightly different. But before we move on entirely, I want to plug my own work for a second. If you enjoy these videos and have got to 20 minutes into one, I'd strongly implore you to subscribe. I'd also invite you to like these videos and comment as well. Your comments are important, and while I don't respond to every single one, I do read them all. And if you really enjoy these videos, then please share these videos far and wide. And if you really, really like it, consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/Byron Lewis. Thank you. Also, the rest of this video will be light on visuals. We are reaching a very strict deadline, and I just want to get things moving. And now the other Sopranos questions. I won't have as much time to go into them, but we will do it. Goose Films asks, do you think there is actually anything supernatural going on in The Sopranos? For example, when Paulie sees the Virgin Mary, it is reflected in a mirror, implying that she is physically there with him. Are we just seeing the guilt and paranoia of the characters depicted in a heightened reality type of way? And are we just seeing what they see and not what's really happening? Right, I'll give out my cop-out answer first. I think there's a potential for the supernatural to exist in the show, but I think each writer's answer for it would be different. What I can't distinguish in my own reading is whether we're meant to take the perils of recording on Bonfire Night. What I can't always distinguish in my own reading of the show is whether we're meant to take all of them at face value, or if it does speak to their existing paranoia, as Mr. Goosefilms asks. As an organised phenomenon, Chase is highly critical and intensely cynical of the Catholic order, though while it critiques the sincerity of belief, it never critiques the existence of belief itself, or at least in my view. Now, when I read psychology, I was guided by my tutor to focus on something called terror management theory, a branch of social psychology that posits, somewhat controversially, that most of human behaviour stems from trying to distract us all from the fact that one day we will die. From an evolutionary perspective, it's posited that because we are cognizant of the fact that it could happen theoretically at any time, for any reason, we have to protect ourselves from that, otherwise we will not be able to do anything else. That death anxiety must be satiated. And it's satiated in our world with many different things. We have what is sometimes called a dual component anxiety buffer. One of those components is the cultural worldview, that is, things that take up our time, politics, sport, religion, things that are important to us. The second thing is self-worth, how we feel about being perceived as living up to said views. All of this aids or inhibits our ability to not think about the fact that time is limited. So this question to me is especially interesting because I think that the supernatural, or the belief in the supernatural, is part of one of their ways to mitigate what's going to happen to them. Think about in the entire run of the show their constant fear of death itself. Not just death of the institution, death of the marriage, death of the society that they live in, death of their culture, but also the individual's death. And of course the individual running supreme throughout the world of the Sopranos, despite the adherence to an alleged group identity. There is a motivation to avoid death for fear of judgment based on their existing beliefs. Think about when Chrissy's shot and he has the dream that involves him going to hell, a hell that is entirely an Irish pub. Of course that bit's an attack on his identity, but everything else surrounding it is an attack on him as an individual. If he's sent there in the way that he's expecting, he'll be weighed up for the sins he's committed on Earth. This is quite funny to me because before thinking about it, my gut feeling was that the Soprano crime family would be more concerned with their worldview of the mafia itself, the fraternity and the importance of that family. I think the supernatural stuff really challenges that because ultimately they do have some degree of Catholic guilt, even if they don't really understand their own religion or follow it particularly closely. Tying us back to terror management theory, the idea of an afterlife generally gives people hope or comfort away from death anxiety. However, these people know that they have sinned, and they know that they're going straight in the sin bin. Now, I don't think I really need to point out that David Chase probably wasn't familiar with the works of Solomon, Greenberg and Pasinski whilst writing The Sopranos, but as with everything, I think it's an interesting reading into their thoughts and feelings, and I do think that ties directly into whether the supernatural exists within the show, so to speak. Because it only seems to happen to characters that do tangentially believe in it. Paulie, for example, or Chrissy, do profess some degree of loyalty to that system. Indeed, when it comes to characters that are completely devoid of any sort of religiosity, characters like Tony, for example, it is entirely through the lens of secular dreaming. There's not even iconography here. Tony also famously doesn't believe in an afterlife. Once it happens, and you're gone. He doesn't really possess that fear of an afterlife that a lot of other characters do. So with that being said, I think it fits the moments that the characters are actually in. I have no idea if they're... As a viewer, I'm not entirely sure if they do happen, or if they're just manifestations of their existing paranoia and death anxiety. It's hard to answer. What I think is important to stress, though, is that Chase was never critical of belief itself so much as the organisations and power structures that tend to find their ways with belief. The Cold Reader stuff, for example, is played very much as a man clearly conning people until suddenly it just isn't. Is this minor character prescient to information we don't know as a viewer? Is Paulie projecting something else into his mouth? Is Paulie putting words in his mouth as he recounts it to himself? There are parts of the show that feel like memories that have already been expressed. Again, we are constantly drawn back to the theme of memory and recollection throughout the entire series. When Dr. Melfi brings up Proust's Madeleines, that wasn't just to be pretentious. Well, it was, but it isn't just for that. There's more to it. It's constantly about recollection, collective nostalgia, and re-understanding and reincorporating experience. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the next question from Naked Snake. What's your opinion about the ending of The Sopranos? Do you believe the theory that Tony is in hell, where he relives the show forever? Thank you, Naked Snake. One day I want to do a whole video on the ending of The Sopranos. Not for a little while, but I will come back to this thread eventually. I think what we see as the ending sits somewhere between the reality we've come to expect within the show and something a bit new. There is no debate to me that this is Tony's end. It is also the end of the show. These don't necessarily have to go together. Is it Tony's death? Yes. This idea is established multiple times in the series as being an instantaneous process. A reading that I do like is that it's a reminder of the underlying themes of media consumption prevalent throughout the show. If you think about the ending and all of its homages to Godfather, very much of their sacred texts, think about why that could be there. Tony Soprano's watching himself from a window, almost like a massive television. The Sopranos are defined by the media they consume, and in death of the character and programme, Tony has become part of that canon. He's watching from the gallows at his own execution. But I feel like there's so much more that could be plumbed from that, so I will come back to it eventually. Escher Painting asks, why do you keep bringing up Blink-182? All will be made clear in part 3 of the look of The Sopranos' third season, especially when assembled into one thing. It is all connected. When I start putting these lines... I deliberately invoke music for a very simple reason. First of all, I can't play it, so I can't have it in the background. But I'm always trying to think of things I can lodge in the back of your head to prime you for something that comes up later. Music is a fantastic shortcut for this, obviously. In a very literal way, it's usually a great shortcut to a thought or feeling, but even bringing it up in passing or reminding you that it exists creates a link for you. AJ is the sort of kid who would have loved Blink back then, even if he would pretend he's just that bit too good for it. It's era appropriate. Also, I just think when I then bring up innocence or the childlike behaviour of characters, or things that do come up, I'm trying to establish that thought should be in your head. Also, I just think it's a fun way of reminding myself what I was listening to that week. Large parts of the first part of the video were written in Malpensa Airport, waiting 6 hours for a connecting flight. I got a lot written. Talk about bad luck, naming an airport bad thoughts. And now to something a little bit different. Cloud Bloom asks, the analogy to the first 2 seasons being like the defence in a court case and season 3 being the prosecution is freaking brilliant. Where would you put season 4 through 6? And also 6B. 4 I think is kind of in between both if we're sticking with this analogy. 5 is almost the verdict from the jury. The 6A is kind of the sentencing, if you will. And 6B is, well, the life and mainstay in prison. They are trapped here now. There's no way of getting out of it. It is, in effect, death row. Pretty bleak, really. I couldn't find this question when I looked through it again, but I did want to ask, who is the best played character in the show? Who is the best actor or actress? Well, it is an actress. It's probably Edie Falco who plays Carmela. I think she has such an exceptional range. I think she's fantastic at being that character. I think she's brilliant at being shrill. I think she's brilliant at being authoritative. I think she's brilliant at being difficult. Simultaneously entitled yet quite deserving of some levity, you know. She's a fantastic Mother Courage in the world of The Sopranos, and I think very few people would have been able to get it in the same way. When I've seen other things that Edie Falco is in, so I think of Oz, Nurse Jackie, which is really good as well, she is able to capture that kind of simultaneous conceit between being extremely unlikable and morally reprehensible, but also extremely compelling and understandable. She's a distinctly human character. It's the same sort of praise I'd level for someone like Anna Gunn, who plays Skylar White in Breaking Bad. Okay, and with that, I think I've answered the best Sopranos questions. I'm going to go over one slight comment that I saw that a few people have thumbed up from the guy 1191. I'd much rather people had actual names. There's a brief clip that I show from the episode Funhouse where, in the dream, Big Pussy says to Tony, "You passed me over for promotion you knew." And the guy, 1191, adds, "I always thought that line indicated that Tony already subconsciously knew Pussy was an informant. That's why he passed him over for promotion. That's why he passed him over for promotion. Not that Pussy became an informant after being passed over." Also, this is a really great video, way better than most Soprano analyses, which is just a summary. Well, thank you, that does mean a lot, and I'm glad that you feel comfortable enough to actually raise a criticism with someone that you watch, because I agree with you. I think I got it wrong. There will be a slight correction, obviously might be changed, in the omnibus edition of the video in a few months' time. Again, I don't think it takes away from the points that I raise in that section, but I will agree that I got it slightly wrong. So apologies for that, and I hope you enjoy what we've got coming next. Specifically some more questions, because we're now going to move away from The Sopranos, well, a little bit, and talk about television more broadly. I'm going to warn you all, I'm a little bit rubbish with screen names, so apologies if I do say this wrong. Mr. Calnaldo, spelt Calnaldo, like Ronaldo, asks a very interesting question. In light of your essay on how The Sopranos changed television, what do you believe are the biggest problems of the post-Sopranos TV world that is directly inspired by the show, And what still differentiates Sopranos from its successors and keeps it ahead? Well, you've kind of answered part of the question for me because we are in agreement. I do think that The Sopranos stands out in a way that other TV programmes don't and keeps ahead, largely because of some of the things that I'm going to now discuss in the scripted bit. I think the largest problem modern American and British television faces is the new rules generation have few ideas past shocking people, and producers don't really see much beyond making profit. The Sopranos is almost a gateway for something a bit more experimental in mainstream English-speaking television. Notice I'm deliberately excluding the consonant here. Even something quite murder by numbers like Engrenage has a lot more depth and emotional resonance than something like, say, CSI or Law & Order. We'll get to some TV recommendations in a bit, but we will come back to that thread. Answering Canaldo's question, or phenomenal that he is, I think it all comes back to that shocking ideas point. There's not a lot of art for art's sake, not that there ever was, and there's rarely a time where I feel like I'm being challenged or asked questions. In an interview David Chase gave for a book, a companion book, a few years into the development of The Sopranos, he does mention that he liked that Italian foreign films especially, and the French New Wave, didn't tell him what to think, how to think, or what to feel. If there was ever a sort of no hugging, no learning motto for The Sopranos, it would be you're not told how to think or feel, and the show creates and crafts some very new emotional states. I do actually watch a surprising amount of mainstream normal television, and to be honest, it's just choreographed. You're told exactly how to think and feel, largely communicated by music. This probably isn't a shock, but I'm a massive fan of Martin Keary's work, aka Tantacruel. You should go and watch his video on reality television if you haven't already. But even in narrative dramas, I think that mood music is just awful. I just don't think it helps at all. And I think it really narrows your perception of events, which I think ultimately masks the shallowness of certain works and definitely the hollow qualities of a lot of modern serial dramas. But it's not just television. Even intellectual think-piece wankery tends to be fairly hollow too. Take something like Saltburn, a shallow work glibly obsessed with looking deep and shocking, rather than being either. The bathwater scene might be shocking if you've only ever thought about young adult fiction all day, but as an actual work with anything to say, it doesn't really say anything that hasn't been said already, better, by other people. Speaking of that, on the subject of shock moments, Netflix shows, especially ones with mass market appeal, need to have a hook to sell people on, and usually it's that scene. I really don't like this idea, but I'll go into it. For example, the Ed Gein thing from a few weeks ago had that scene, that awful moment that you just have to talk about. 13 Reasons Why had 2 that scenes, and then every year they try to do a new one that just ended up being funny. Baby Reindeer had that scene. The thing with the cop in the woods, I didn't finish it, that had that scene. A lot of it becomes making something horrible for the sake of shock value and not really artistry. Making something upsetting in the hopes that people will talk about it on Twitter is not brave, in the way that something like, say, Poor Things is. I thought Poor Things was brilliant. I'm a big Yorgos Lanthimos fan. Now that is a film filled with shocking content, right? I remember how I felt the first time I saw it, and the bit where Mark Ruffalo and Emma Stone first get together. I don't think I've ever felt that uncomfortable in a cinema before. That was just, no, it just felt wrong. But again, by it being there, it's asking you, why are you uncomfortable? It's not just going, oh, look at this, creepy. That's kind of the Saltburn school of symbolism. But it's extremely important to the story. The entire story is about sexuality. The entire story is about innocence or lost innocence. So many difficult questions conjured up at once, and, that's what difficult art is meant to provide. There's so many different ways of reading Poor Things, and I thought that was my favourite film that year. What was that, 2023? Brilliant film. Brilliant. What I find fascinating, though, is how these things trickle down. I would say a lot of that scene moments are kind of indirectly the fault of Gaspar Noé. Specifically Irreversible, and if you've seen the film or know of it, you'll know exactly what I mean. In the middle of Irreversible, which is a story told backwards, by the way, we see a very traumatic assault scene, and it just goes on forever. It's fucking horrible. I did actually have to speed through it. Gaspar Noé is the only director where I've actually had to pause a film and go for a walk in the middle. He is, however, leagues above that scene crowd. It is shocking and provocative, and the whole film is just a bit try-hard. It's my least favourite Noé film. Somehow it's worse than Love. I do think that Noé is trying to say something, though. The whole film has a theme and a message, and at no point do I think it's just exploitative or to get bums on seats. I think ultimately it's in service to a vision. I don't think you could say the same for a lot of the Netflix dramas. It is a real pity that the one thing that I was hoping that The Sopranos could teach other programmes, or the one thing they could borrow from the world of cinema, is that trust in the spectator. Television as an art form is a new medium, though. It's only 100 years old. We've been painting caves for tens of thousands of years. We've been singing and making music for also thousands of years. We've been writing on the printing press for hundreds of years. And yet television is still in its first century. So I do think it's possible, I just don't know when it will happen. And that's not to say that it hasn't happened at all. It's just it needs to happen more often. Are there any other shows that you think have heavily influenced serial dramas? Yes, there are plenty. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I think there are some really important ones. And I really want to focus on the British contribution here. I think that all modern serial dramas, realist or surrealist, put together in the way we like, trace a lineage back to 60s productions. I think people sometimes ignore just how important a director like Ken Loach was for giving us the realist dramas that we have now. I think a lot of things can be traced back to Kathy Come Home, which is phenomenal. If you've never seen it, I think it's on YouTube, so just go and watch it. Even something a generation later, like Abigail's Party, is also extremely important, and I would also recommend. Yes, they are plays, but they did have a direct impact on how people wrote for television. I think it was crucial because it showed that the experimental, more realist forms of drama that, say, the Angry Young Men had pioneered on the West End stage was something that could translate well to television, a more mainstream, popular audience. I think these plays started to impact things like miniseries. Something like I, Claudius has a direct connection to those plays for today, for example. Somewhat interestingly, I, Claudius, I feel like, is written like 13 little plays, much like Chase's 13 little films. I've not seen anyone make this connection before on YouTube, but I really don't think the surreal elements of, say, something like The Sopranos would have happened in the same way if it wasn't for The Prisoner. The Prisoner is a late 60s British drama that I can't explain. It's just too odd and too brilliant. I think you're just going to have to watch it. All you need to know, this man trapped in a weird Welsh village. The British dramas of the 60s and 70s were often exported across the pond, and a lot of screenwriters do tend to mention them when you look for it. So I think in their own way, those examples did push the medium forward, and I do think they're directly responsible for a lot of what has come next. Which I hope kind of answers your question. This question is from Naked Snake. This is somewhat off topic, absolutely fine with me, but do you think a modern day adaptation of Less Than Zero, based off Bret Easton Ellis's work, could be adapted faithfully? The book doesn't have much of a plot, it's more of a series of events. Not sure if I agree with that. I'm no film producer, but the thought of adapting that seems challenging, which is why I think the 1998 adaptation of the book had to change so much, because let's face it, no audience wants to sit in front of their television and watch a bunch of college kids party around and get abused without some kind of plot happening. I will have to push back on that. We do live in a world with euphoria. Not to say that there isn't a plot in Less Than Zero, but it's really slow. I'm curious to hear what your perspective would be on this, since you are a professional editor. Well, thank you. Mr. Snake. Allow me to try and answer this question by saying I'm not really sure. I disagree with the idea that there isn't a plot in Less Than Zero. I must apologise. I think there's quite a clear plot that Clay, our protagonist, comes back home, he reunites with his old friends, but they're just not what he wants anymore, and he's completely unfulfilled. Everybody's stunted in their own way, everybody has their own flaws, and Clay is just not that interested. He is too self-obsessed to meaningfully change the world that he's in. Even when it all goes very Bret Easton-Ellis and suddenly there's some very shocking moments in the book, I don't think any of them are completely unadaptable, but there's nothing in Less Than Zero that is impossible to talk about, for example, or impossible to put in a film. Maybe structured as sort of 6 to 8 episodes, or, somewhat radically, 13 shorter episodes. I'm borrowing from the Japanese way of doing what I believe they're called OVAs, which are sort of short anime miniseries. I'm not a big anime person, but I do really like Paranoia Agent and Trapeze, so that's where I got that idea from. I think in some ways a shorter, more frequent episodic format might work quite well, because these are sort of fleeting, floating events almost. Because these are fleeting, floating events, I also think something of a sense of humour would work better too. One thing that does make Bret Easton-Ellis's work so compelling, I think, is that you are often laughing when you really shouldn't be. A lot of Clay's complaints, Bateman's banal delusions, even something like Glamorama, which isn't particularly good, still keeps you reading it because the characters are funny and the situations are absurd and silly. In a way, keeping with that shorter episode format, it would be interesting to see it adapted as keeping with that sort of more radical format, what if it was sort of adapted almost like a sitcom? What if it was structured more like a sort of generic, the sort of white noise background to life that Clay, I think, really takes issue with? Potentially, the format could change as the show goes on. You have that sort of initial framing, but as Clay gets more distant, more concerned with the world around him, yet still ineffective, things start to shift and people come in and out, and I think there's a lot of different ways you could frame it, and it would be fascinating to watch. I think you could also portray the events in a slightly more linear, closer to follow order while still being content, while still having the same amount of content. For example, you could have an episode kind of focused on Julian or his pimp, Finn, and you could have an episode focused on Rip, the dealer, who then just seems to degenerate everything around him constantly, to that point, if you have read the book. I think some of this depends on how you'd want to interpret it. Would you want Clay to be the clear protagonist going from episode to episode, or would you rather he's the sort of dull force moving things forward? Again, I mentioned Paranoia Agent, but think about how the detectives in Paranoia Agent are there. Of course, they do appear in almost every episode, I think. But the main focus isn't always them. You have episodes focusing on other things. You have stories within that. Do you want it to explicitly be the Clay story, or is Clay's story part of everyone's lives? I guess it's a difficult question to answer. And before I forget, I guess the closest we've got to an adaptation of Less Than Zero is, and I know people will make fun of me for saying this, Euphoria. It's just shit. I really didn't like it. I would say that Less Than Zero is one of the more adaptable Bret Easton Ellis books. It would be impossible to make a film of Luna Park, I think. Well, actually, is it? You could have it as a sort of mock documentary that goes off the rails, but I don't know. I think it would be a bit crap. And on the subject of adapting television, here's a very long question from B, spelled B-E-E. This is a very vivid question. I'll be cutting some of it down for time, but I still want to give it some thought. This is a hypothetical. Let's say they reboot Dexter because Paramount isn't doing so well. Original Sin is still cancelled, the viewers realise Resurrection is actually very bad, and Michael C. Hall does something else. Desperate executives somehow put you in charge of this fresh new take on Dexter. My question is less, who would you cast, and more, how would you approach the material? What would the crux be of this new show? There are no limits of budget or anything, so we could film the whole thing on location. What does Dexter, created and executive produced by Byron Lewis, look like? Great videos, congrats on getting so many new subscribers. I'm happy to be one of the recent ones, and I'm looking forward to see where you go from here. Well, thank you very much for that. That is a lovely question that allows me to justifiably write some fanfiction. Here goes. The crux of the show would be, very obliquely, the spin war of the delusional, lovable narcissist that is Dexter Morgan. He's not vain about his looks like Batman, or incensed about fighting crime like Batman, but he is fighting something else. He thinks he is the greatest serial killer of them all, pushed into vigilantism just to keep it going. Deep down, he knows that there's a nurturing going on. He was nurtured to kill people in this way. But everything he says is a walking contradiction. I would love to explore that more. I'd also love to explore the idea of Dexter, and Dexter without Dexter being in it. How does this impact the world around him? How does it impact the police department? How does it impact his sister, his family? I'd want to see more of that. Less about him. Less about him as a person, but more about the idea of him. Dexter as a work is an adaptation of a series of books that I probably would consider reading if they gave me the job. That doesn't mean that I have any interest in following it. Dexter as a character is, in my view, close to entering our generation's equivalent of a stock character, placeable in any story and any work, and people will want to watch it. Sort of like a modern-day Dick Turpin or Dick Whittington. Dexter. I agree with B that the show has to be filmed in Miami. I don't care how rainy it is. Losing that lost its edge, it lost its flavour. From what I've read online, Miami is a very different place than it was 20 years before. I'd want to reflect that better. On a granular dialogue level, I think there needs to be more spoken Spanish. I think it makes sense that there is a sort of cultural gap between the sort of white English Miami and the Hispanic, Latino, Cuban, I think, Miami. That would be interesting. There's a lot that can be said, and I think you could definitely play into some of the ideas that the show wants to tread on, but can't by going through that. But then, simultaneously, I think, well, Dexter would work better if it was approached closer in tone to the things that it wants to be more like, something like Psych, rather than going for the gritty realism. It is a pulpy story in a pulpy way. I think you could be more impactful if you went the campier way, at least from the beginning, for one simple reason though. People let their guard down when they're laughing. The best of Dexter's killing in the show is when he engages them in conversation. There needs to be more of that. Also, I think it would be way more impactful if the show decided to ask more difficult questions of its audience if it got them comfortable first. Dexter should be constantly trying to sell you on the idea that he's brilliant, even though we kind of know he's a bit pathetic. I think if I wrote it, Dexter as a character would be a lot more flawed in his approach. He knows enough to keep him safe, but he's not a genius. I want a way bigger gap between the impossible Dexter the character gives us and what we see unfold on screen. I'd like to see him be a bit more crap at his job. Dexter also needs some actual hobbies as well. He's not self-interested. As a character, he's not self-interested, so why not make more of it? What if he was more of a cook? I could see someone like him playing an instrument, something orderly and loud. I like the idea that he's fascinated by blood splatter but actually isn't very good at it, or that he's motivated by it because it's not as good as the ones that he comes up with. I think if I wrote it, Dexter and Brian would be a bit more cultured as well. Wouldn't it be funny if Dexter was really into like brutalist architecture, sort of grey, sort of just empty stuff because he has no feelings after all? But Brian is really into expressive violence like Francis Bacon or Goya, or only reads the good bits of J.G. Ballard. I think if I wrote it, I'd make more of Dexter's addictive personality. I think the AA stuff from the original show's second season would be much better if it was played straight and explored more. Like Jesse in Breaking Bad when he launders stories to his AA group, or Tony in Dr. Melfi's waiting room, he can absolve himself of some guilt with a supportive audience, sort of Greek chorus telling him that he's brilliant. Dexter can be a bit weird, but I just don't buy that he wouldn't have any friends. I think in some ways that would lead to his discovery, surely. It's always the quiet ones, after all. So it would make more sense if he actually put in some effort. Maybe he learned to do this during the show's run. I also like the idea of coming into Dexter's world just that little bit before the show actually starts. What if we don't have Rita from the beginning? What if Dexter's single to start with, and he slowly starts to piece it together? The focus is kind of more, Dexter realises he's kind of on the edge of being discovered by being this sloppy, so he makes more of an effort to pass into normal society, maybe. But the fact that he's thinking about that just makes some of those around him, like Dokes for example, more suspicious. Speaking of, we just wouldn't kill anyone off, at least to begin with. Dokes and Brian would never be killed off when they were. Brian would form more of a Mycroft-esque role within the show for me, providing practical assistance but also serving as a totally rule-breaking impossible aspiration for Dexter. Remember, Dexter loves the fact that he abides by his code. It's one of his ways to sell his narcissist murdering to you. Similarly, I think Dokes needs to stay around for the whole show's run. He needs to slowly investigate the pieces of the ice truck killer. Maybe when the Bay Harbor Butcher stuff starts, they think they're connected because the ice truck killer was never properly solved. As Brian never dies, he just disappears. And piece by piece, he uncovers bits of the story, and as the show goes on, maybe in, like, say, the 4th or 5th season, I think things from the early series start to add up in new ways, constantly reincorporating things that have happened before, or getting you to think about them again. I'd have an eye for it being just 4, maybe 5 seasons, very focused, tight, 8-episode max seasons, with the final season almost entirely focusing on the collapse of Dexter's identity. I think the 5th series should start to turn things on the audience a bit, not in a necessarily mean-spirited way, but just again, asking difficult questions. I like the idea that somewhere in the mid-series, there is a real moral dilemma that's more than just, oh, should Dexter kill this murderer? Something actually difficult. Maybe Dexter goes along with Brian to kill an innocent civilian, and we're forced to reckon with that. I don't know. Anyway, going back to all of this, I think Dexter should be tried. I think the last half of the series should be the trial almost, but due to popular outcry in support of the Bay Harbor Butcher, jury selection just keeps getting delayed and delayed. And maybe eventually he's let go by way of jury nullification. Dexter's antics are celebrated by the audience. Dexter's antics are celebrated by the public, so why not show that in the show? Admittedly, these are all off-the-cuff ideas, so I'd love to hear what you think about this. I hope that kind of answers your question. And now we move on to a slightly different TV programme. This is from Caber Knight. And now we're going to move on to some questions about me, or questions that I can answer about myself. Will you plan on doing an in-depth video or series on the 3rd season of Twin Peaks, The Return, after you've done The Sopranos? I would absolutely love to, but I have a big fear. My fear is that somehow it will be even less accessible than the surrealism stuff. It's the same thing that makes me want to cover the works of Peter Greenaway. I just need to find a way of talking about Peaks, talking about The Cook the Thief, in a way that is a bit different to what else is out there already, but also still quintessentially me, getting you to think about bigger ideas and not just doing a recap. If I did do something, it would focus on The Return, but I just need to work out how to do it. I'm not sure yet. Something more repeat viewers and listeners may have noticed is my tendency to talk about lots of other works, or indeed the importance of understanding other works by talking about other works. Yes, the video is about The Sopranos, but really it's about everything, isn't it? It's about Fellini, it's about David Lynch, it's about Chris Morris. I like bringing in different readings, but I also like bringing in different works, talking about what makes them different, how one has influenced the other, what you can derive from all of this. I would also not explain it. I hate the idea of explaining television, but I really hate it when it comes to surrealist work. You can't explain Twin Peaks. It would be like explaining The Great Debater. What do you explain? What is this? I don't know how to explain. But yes, ultimately, I would love to do it. I'd love to talk about Twin Peaks. I'm curious about the outtakes you leave in your videos. In this last part, you mentioned it being part of the rhythm. Is it always intentional? This was asked by Yovi Shark. Sometimes, but not always. I'm a big fan of that sort of Keith Floyd style of incorporating the errors as part of the program. I think that's kind of fun, and there are times where technical errors make their way into the final cut. I always see the version that goes out as something that can be further refined once it comes into the multi-part omnibus video. I'd much rather get something out than just stew on it forever. However, even then, things will change between them other than this. I could see a world where the surrealism conversation in Weird Enough is cut down or spread out a bit more by the time of the Omnibus Season 3 retrospective. It also kind of reminds you that I'm a person on the other side of this. I don't want you to think that I'm Byron GPT, capable of no mistakes. I am just a normal person, after all. We all are. Naked Snake asks, any music recommendations for this winter season? Yes, I'm about to stream Lux by Rosalia, pretty much as soon as I finish this, depending on when this video is going out. Berghain with Björk, incredible, fantastic. I can't wait to hear the album. I'm really, really excited. Any recommendations for this winter, though? When I was growing up, my favourite singer was probably Suzanne Vega, and I don't know, I just feel like it's maybe not winter, but there's a very autumnal quality to her music, and go and stream Marlena on the Wall. What do you think about the rise of AI content and slop on YouTube? Are you worried about this existentially? Name withheld. Yes, but maybe not as much as I once was. And there are a few reasons for this. There are some obvious limits with what LLMs are capable of. I have been researching this space a bit, and actually over the weekend struck up a conversation with some lovely AI researchers the other day. One thing I find really interesting is when you strip away the marketing, the business people, and you talk to the computer scientists involved with machine learning, their beliefs and understanding is so different to the science fiction that we're given by the press, by podcasts, by podcasters, by client journalists working for the big tech and big AI firms. My biggest concern is the way that AI is labelled, the way it's talked about as artificial intelligence. I don't think that's accurate. I wouldn't describe it as intelligence. It is spitting back ideas that you already have, or words that you want to hear. That's not intelligence. It's not replacing your thought process. The difference to me is mentality and how you use it. It should not replace your own thinking. It is best used to expand your ability. It should not be used to replace creative decision. It should not be allowed to replace creative work. The next question is from many different people. Why do you say series instead of season? Now, this is important to say. In the UK, we have always classically referred to series of programs, what Americans call seasons, as series with American television. In the last 10 years, this has started to shift, but not in print journalism, not in the media, and not in academic circles. So, understandably, I still say series. When writing about film and television, I was always expected to write series, not season. It is a force of habit. What I find a little bit depressing about some people's media literacy is this is the only complaint they have in an hour's worth of media criticism or analysis. This is the only takeaway they have. The honest truth, unfortunately for me, is that American English is more widespread than British English today. So consequently, consciously, I am trying to say seasoned more. However, if it does slip out, it isn't the end of the world. Get over it. And finally, one last question. Do you think that you're pretentious? Pretentious? Moi? The honest truth is I obviously don't see myself as pretentious. I can see myself as inaccessible, out of touch maybe sometimes, but not pretentious, because I think pretension hinges primarily on trying to convince other people that you're well read. I don't want to do that. I don't need to do that. I have nothing to gain from it. I just want to talk about media. I just want to talk about the arts. I'm privileged enough to have some knowledge about the arts that other people don't have, both on-screen and off-screen. I'm privileged enough to have read many books that people haven't, to have seen many films that people haven't. For me, this came from my family. I was genuinely interested in the arts. I was interested in the classics, all from a young age. That is entirely down to my upbringing. That is something that I wish more people had, and if I can try and give that enthusiasm back in some small way to people who didn't get it, well, that's kind of what I want to do. I have a genuine love for it. I'm not trying to hold it over you. Nor am I self-obsessed enough to say something like I'm giving away my degree for free. I'm really not. I just want to treat you like an adult and also give you a pathway to finding other things that you might not have experienced yet. That's how I see myself. I'm aggregating many different things that you could go off and enjoy too. And ultimately, I think that brings us to the end. To celebrate not being pretentious, I give to you me answering Proust's 1890s confessionals for you all. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for watching and sticking around. I am so thankful that I have an audience that is willing to engage with art critically, and I can't wait to continue doing that for you. Thank you so much, and, well, let's get to it.
What is your idea of happiness?
Being surrounded by people I love, being around for the people I care about most. Somewhere hot.
What is your idea of misery?
Being left to my own devices, being bored, not being challenged, having nothing to read.
What is your main fault?
I'm a perfectionist. I will do something 100 times. Doesn't mean it's any better, but I will just keep going. I'll keep trying to search for that better version of something. And it never comes. It never will. It's a fool's game, but it's hard to explain that to myself sometimes, It's only possible when I work with other people and they sort of tell me this is ridiculous or you need to just stop doing that and just get something out. I think if I had my own way, these videos would just come out once every few years, because I'd be constantly refining every word and every sentence. It would just suck.
If not yourself, who would you be?
I'd love to be a painter. I've always wanted to be a painter. I just can't draw. I don't have the dexterity for it. I never have. But I've always been very jealous of that. Yeah, I'd love to be a painter. No one specific, nobody famous necessarily. Just that'd be a skill that I wish I had. Or that I wished that I had, even.
Where would you like to live?
Holland. I've always wanted to live in Amsterdam. I just love the canals and I love the culture.
What's your favorite color?
Magenta. Everything that has my name on it tends to have magenta in there somewhere, Except these videos. There's no magenta, but maybe they should have some. I don't know.
Who are your favorite authors?
I love Dostoevsky. I think The Double's probably my favourite story. James Joyce. George Orwell. I love how he structures something. I love how readable Animal Farm is, I think the reason that something like Orwell is taught in schools is probably not because of the themes necessarily, but because it's so easy to pick apart. He writes in such an easy to follow way. I've always wished that I could communicate that well, and maybe one day, maybe I will. Who knows?
Your favorite heroes in fiction?
I don't know if he really counts as a hero, but I've always found the Double, Golyadkin from The Double fascinating. He's not really a hero, but he's called our hero, but a hero he's not.
What about your favorite heroines in fiction?
Very different direction. I've always felt quite a strong relation to the new Mrs. De Winter from Rebecca, especially when I was a younger man. Definitely trying to find myself. I think that sort of naivety, and also just general willing that things will get better. It speaks to being very young and innocent and being swept off your feet by an older gent. We've all been there.
Your favorite painters and composers?
Liszewski. I love that sort of Russian, unfortunately named Russian suprematism period in art. I've always found Liszewski, Malevich as well, is one of my favourite painters. But then on the other side of that, I do also like, I love Rembrandt. I love Bosch. Getting to see The Night Watch in person was one of the best experiences that I've ever had in a gallery before. Even though it's behind a screen, there's something just so expressive about his work. My parents are big Van Gogh fans and big Monet fans. I like them, but they're not my favourites. You know, when I went to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, that did kind of change how I look at painting. There's something a bit mournful about all of his work, and I understand that's part of the fact that he was a very tortured person, but I could never really obsess over that. I like the sort of the realism and the abstract, like, in two very different ways. Mondrian, Piet Mondrian, of course. You know, I like him too. Composers, there's only one answer. It's not a particularly... it's the sort of answer that's going to annoy people. I've annoyed many musicologists over the years by saying this, but Eric Satie is my favourite composer. I know he never wrote the most complicated work or the most important work, but Gymnopédie, they're so important to me personally, and have shaped a lot of what I like in music.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
That's a fascinating question with a very long answer. Allow me to get into it. In the beginning...